Good afternoon and welcome to the CFA Boston Sustainable Investing session on understanding the evolving S landscape through its foundations in human rights. My name is Michael Grice. I'm chair of the CFA Boston Sustainable Investing Initiative. We thank you for attending and I'm delighted to have you with us for today's event. I want to briefly mention that our next session, which will be on fiduciary duty, will take place on May 20th, and registration will be open later today or first thing tomorrow. Fiduciary duty is an enduring and steadfast principle, and it seems like it's in a state of constancy, but it's not. The interpretation and application of this concept has evolved, and we welcome you to join us as we host David Weber, professor of law at BU, and Andrew Parry, head of sustainable investing at Newton Investment Management in the UK. As we talk about, they share their views on fiduciary duty, what it is, what it's not, how it's changing both in the United States as well as across the Atlantic. Now, over the last several years, as we have assembled our yearly sustainable investing conference, interest in S topics has been growing. And in fact, as we know this year, and you probably read in the introduction that we prepared for the event, the pandemic sharpened the focus on S and ESG as well. How well have corporations been prepared to respond to their workforce, their supply chain, their customers, and basically all of their stakeholders for a disruption that was unprecedented, certainly within the last 30, 40, or 50 years. There is a very tight interconnection between health, climate change, and inequality. All of those topics are at the front burner here in the United States and around the world. We've all seen the asset flows into ESG funds, and there's a lot of questions about where all those are going, but clearly there's a lot of interest from the people putting their money into these funds in these topics. So we have a lot more interest globally in the human rights regimes and how governments and agencies around the world are speaking to each other. And so we wanted to bring this all together. And in fact, it seems sometimes that the S topics are all over the map, from who is impacted to what people are talking about. But in fact, at the core, what underpins all those issues are human beings and human rights. So what we wanted to do was to go back to that and have a session in which we begin with very fundamentally the human rights issues and the underpinnings, the legal and frameworks for human rights, and how investors are now addressing human rights-based issues, investors and asset owners in that context. And what this does is not only we hope you walk away with some really interesting insights as to how investors are dealing with the human rights issues, but also as you think about other S issues, human rights are part of those, even though it sometimes may seem like a workforce and diversity, equity, inclusion may not be human rights in a first world context. They really all trace back to that. So that's our goal for today. And we hope you come away with a good base and a framework, and we'll have a chance to ask questions. So as we go through the session, please put questions in the Q&A box. And as we get through the conversation, we'll have time for some open questions at the end. So what I'd like to do now is to turn this over to kind of our session leader and moderator, Anita Doran. Anita, welcome.
Great. No, thanks so much, Michael. And good afternoon and good morning to all of you. Thank you to CFA Society Boston for organizing this session on discussing the S and ESG in the context of human rights in the investment lifecycle. And thank you to all of you for attending this session. Just a little bit about the Investor Alliance for Human Rights to start. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights is a coalition of responsible investors. We were launched in 2018 as an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. The Investor Alliance provides a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in the respect for people's fundamental rights, human rights, the topic of today's webinar. We are a membership-based organization focusing on investor responsibility to respect human rights, corporate engagements that drive responsible business conduct, and engagement with standard-setting bodies to push for robust business and human rights policies. We have a membership of about 180 institutional investors, including asset managers, trade union funds, public pension funds, foundations, and endowments, and our current membership represents a total of 5.5 trillion in assets under management across 18 countries. Along with civil society allies, the Investor Alliance serves to equip the investment community with expertise and opportunities to put investor responsibility into practice. The Investor Alliance is focused on increasing capacity and scaling up the number of investors engaging with companies on their human rights responsibility pursuant to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, something that I will be spending a little bit of time talking to you about later. So with that, Michael, could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Well, this is our lovely panelists, and I'll come back to them because they will be providing us great insight towards the end of my presentation, and I'll introduce our panelists then. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. So let's talk about our global community. Both people and planet face severe crisis, from the COVID-19 pandemic that Michael was referring to climate crisis, to growing social and economic inequalities. Risks posed by ever-evolving technology has resulted in the proliferation of misinformation, viral hate speech. There's been increased levels of illegal surveillance and discrimination against marginalized communities. We hear about racial and gender discrimination that is embedded into artificial intelligence and algorithmic bias. More than 40 million people are living in situations of modern slavery, and it's estimated 152 million children are in child labor, many of whom work in supply chains for companies that we invest in. Businesses, including investors, play a central role now more than ever in supporting the recovery and positively contributing to equitable and resilient systems grounded in the respect for human rights. We've moved away from the era of shareholder primacy to one of stakeholder capitalism, where businesses focuses not just on shareholders, but on the well-being and wants of the community, of employees, of customers, of communities and suppliers. Next slide, please. So this is the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which is the authoritative global framework for addressing business impacts on human rights. The framework was unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011, and the framework clarifies the respective duties of not just government, but of businesses in tackling human rights risks related to business activities. Businesses have a responsibility to prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address human rights impacts that are connected to their business activities and their business relationships. The responsibility exists independent of whether or not government fulfills their human rights obligations. The focus of their responsibility is on negative impacts caused or contributed to by business activities through operations and relationships, and it cannot be offset by doing good elsewhere through charitable or philanthropic efforts. So the UNGPs have been widely adopted by global businesses around the world. So it's nothing new. In the last decade, companies like Unilever and Nestle, Citibank and ABN AMRO, Nike and Adidas, and more recently, Amazon and Facebook have all adopted the UN Guiding Principles as their risk management process to address human rights risks in their business operations. Next slide, please. So in general terms, what do we mean by human rights? Human rights are what every individual is entitled to in order to live a life of fundamental welfare, dignity, and equality. And when we speak to human rights responsibility, we are referring to internationally recognized human rights laws and conventions. And on this slide, it represents really the minimum set of rules or conventions that we should be considering as investors in businesses. You have the UN Declaration of Human Rights, together with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That covers rights to privacy, free expression, rights to equality and non-discrimination, as well as the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which addresses adequate standards of living, right to health care, and right to fair and just work conditions. We also have the International Labour Organization, or the ILO Conventions on Labor Rights, and this encompasses rights of freedom of expression, collective bargaining, and freedom from forced labor and the worst of child labor. Next slide, please. When we are looking at human rights risks, or what is referred to in the UN guiding principles as salient risks. We're looking at risk to people resulting from business activities. This is very different from looking at material risk, which is looking at risk to business. So salient risk is really looking at risk to people. So in this context, when we're looking at risk, we're looking at it from two different lenses. There is often overlap in these risks, where salient human rights risk impacts converge with risk to business. As we will all agree, where there is severe risk to people, then there is risk to business, risk to the financial, legal, and reputational performance of a company. Take the Dakota Access Pipeline project. Lack of consultation by the owners and the operators with local communities like the Standing Rock Sioux tribe resulted in intensified social conflict and ultimately material loss to Energy Transfer partners in excess of $7.5 billion in costs and losses. Next slide, please. So really, what is this UNGPs? It is really the framework for business respect for human rights. So the UNGPs provides these frameworks through an ongoing and iterative steps that we've listed here that businesses need to take. And this process, these 6 steps, yes, that's right. These 6 steps must be underpinned and informed by stakeholder engagement. And when we talk about stakeholder engagement, we're talking about engaging with communities and other rights holders that are impacted by our business. And I will talk a little bit about that later. But just looking at these steps now, the first thing is that business enterprises are expected to formally commit to respect human rights. And then the next is the human rights due diligence process, which is the 4 sort of tabs in yellow. And this is an ongoing risk management process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how companies address actual and potential adverse human rights impacts. So we're talking about at the first yellow box, identifying and assessing actual or potential adverse human rights impacts that businesses may cause or contribute to. The second is integrating the findings of those impact assessments across relevant business processes and taking appropriate actions according to these processes to address human rights harms. Next is tracking the effectiveness of these measures. Is it actually working to address human rights harms? And last thing is disclosure. You need to communicate publicly how impacts are being addressed. This is key information needed for communities who are impacted and also for us as investors so that we can understand what the human rights risks are and how it is being addressed. This process is not a one-off process, but should be ongoing as the risk, as with any other enterprise risk management process. Risk to human beings change all the time, and it must be informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement. And then lastly, there is remedy. Where a company has caused or contributed to harms, they must ensure that victims of human rights abuses have access to remedy. Next slide, please. So this is what we're talking about today, investments in human rights. Investors as financial actors have an important role in enabling economic and societal well-being. And as Michael mentioned, we are seeing an exponential growth in ESG-based investing. Just in 2020, we see more than $40.5 trillion in assets under management, accounting for 40% of total worldwide AUM in ESG stocks. In the US, in the first quarter of this year, it saw an all-time record level of sustainable fund flows, which when compared to the same period last year, represents a 100% increase, and compared to 2019, represents a 500% increase. So really, we at the investment community needs to understand where the capital markets are driving us. This is where people want to put their money. And so we also see legislation coming into effect to address human rights concerns. For example, on supply chain risk, we've seen the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act and similar modern slavery legislation in the UK and Australia. There's the duty of vigilance law in France, and now the impending mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, which is part of the EU's sustainable financing disclosure reporting, the first phase of which has come into effect just last month. And we as investors are embracing this and understanding that we do need to address risks to people and planet. And BlackRock's Larry Fink's vows loud activism. Just last week, he stated that the investor's voice is imperative in the communities where we work. There is a need for companies to respond to racial injustice, economic inequality, and environmental degradation. He goes on to say that companies that have strong stakeholder capitalism as part of their principles are performing better. So what is good for human rights is good for investments. Next slide, please. So let's try and understand what is the investor's duty to respect human rights and how are investors then connected to human rights harms. So in this diagram, I'm just giving you an example where you as an investor may have invested either in a hardware or software company who provides component parts to a surveillance technology company. Maybe just like a company that provides video surveillance, or you might be an investor who's even directly invested into that. An example of that is Amazon's recognition software, for example. So that doesn't necessarily just have to be a surveillance tech company, but where that product is then sold on to, say, law enforcement or to authoritarian governments, they can be used for illegal surveillance. That illegal surveillance violates the rights to privacy of individuals. So as investors, we are directly linked to that human rights risk, to that violation. And that violation can result in all sorts of consequences, from discrimination to marginalization. So we can talk a little bit more about that when we get to our great panel. So investors have that duty because they are directly linked to human rights harms connected to the business operations and business relationships of their portfolio companies. As owners of these companies, investors have to address human rights due diligence and undertake it to address and mitigate and prevent such harms. And in certain situations, investors may even need to take responsibility to remediate such harms. For example, where you may be invested in private equity and you are a general or limited partner in that companies. And as part of this whole sort of investment process, we need to always ensure that we stay in touch and we're continually engaging our stakeholders. So with that, can you move to slide 10, please? To guide investors in carrying out their human rights duty, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights has developed and published the Investor Toolkit for Human Rights, which helps to translate how the UN guiding principles and this responsibility to respect human rights applies to investors. The toolkit is meant to be a practical guidance providing the basic building blocks on how to implement the UNGPs and embed the human rights due diligence process within your institution and throughout your organization and the investment value chain. The toolkit is specifically designed for asset owners and asset managers. It relates to equity investment, whether in private equity or in public equity, and it speaks to embedding human rights, both at the institutional level and the investment level of the organization. Within this toolkit, we've tried to pull together all the relevant resources on human rights germane to investors in one place so that you can find resources to other important key information. And we've also created tools like checklists and templates and case studies and examples that help to give you an understanding of how investors have been working together to try to embed human rights through their investment activities. It's an ongoing process, it's a journey. There isn't a one size fits all, and it's an evolutionary process. So we all need to, get on this journey together. The next slide, please. So just very quickly, investors need to know the risk to people connected with their investment activities, and they need to show how they take action to manage those risks. Institutional investors, like many of you on the call on this webinar today, often hold investments in wide and diverse range of entities and asset types, and often across many sectors and different regions. This increases the possibility that you may be connected to a wide range of human rights risks and impacts. Investors need to bring in the human rights due diligence model to the investment lifecycle as part of investment decision-making and as part of investment stewardship, and in some cases, even in terms of making decisions on divestment. All this work needs to be informed by stakeholder engagement. And I think we do need to understand, or we do recognize the fact that asset owners and asset managers are typically far removed from these stakeholders, from the individuals and communities most severely affected by activities of portfolio companies. And such it is often impractical for investors to really directly engage with these communities. So what can we do? So investors here, beyond looking at ESG ratings and data provided by ESG data providers, investors need to look further. There are benchmark reports that are specifically addressing human rights risks. There's the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, a report that looks at the human rights performance of 230 companies across 5 high-risk areas. There's the Know the Chain report that looks at forced labor in supply chains across many of the key industries. Ranking Digital Rights, which looks at how technology companies, our most powerful big tech companies, really responds to users' rights to free expression and rights to privacy. And so this information needs to be taken into account to supplement the other information that we use. And in some cases as well, where there are really sort of high issues and egregious human rights harms, it might warrant for some direct engagement with human rights organizations, experts, and credible representatives of rights holders, such as global trade unions, to meaningfully inform and understand what human rights impacts are affecting your investment activities. So on the next slide, I've provided some links to key resources that might be helpful to investors to address this human rights risk. And with that, let's bring the discussion to other investment professionals like yourself. And I'm very pleased to introduce our investment panelists. So today we have Rosa Vanden Beep, who is a corporate engagement practitioner with over 8 years of experience in the responsible investment industry and a vice president with BMO Global Asset Management's responsible investment team. Rosa has extensive experience in North America's corporate governance, engaging management and board members on ESG risks. And at BMO GAM, Rosa focuses on engaging and voting in the North American markets, including oil and gas sector, and specializing in topics of diversity, inclusion, human rights, and Indigenous rights. She also serves on the advisory committee for the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. So welcome, Rosa. And I'm also very fortunate to welcome John Wilson, who is a Vice President and Director of Corporate Engagement for Calvert Research and Management, a wholly owned subsidiary of Eaton Vance Management that specializes in responsible and sustainable investments across global capital markets. He leads the design and execution of Calvert's corporate engagement and shareholder activism strategy, and John manages a team of engagement specialists who monitors issues for engagement opportunities, business change in conjunction with ESG research analysts, and participates in investor coalitions and managing proxy voting guidelines. So welcome, John. We were going to have another panelist today, Emma Pullman, who is the Capital Stewardship Officer with the BC Government and Service Employee Union, but Emma was pulled away for a family emergency. And while she was going to give us some perspective from an asset owner, both Rosa and John, who work with assets owners every day, will be more than happy to share those insights. So with that, again, welcome today to this panel. And just to kick off, I would ask both of you to tell us a little bit about your organization and how and why your organization has incorporated human rights as part of your investment strategy. Maybe Rosa, we can start with you first.
Great, thank you so much, Anita. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. So as Anita mentioned, I work for BMO Global Asset Management. We're the asset management arm of the Bank of Montreal, a Canadian bank. The responsible investment team in which I work is spread over our Amsterdam, London, and Toronto offices, and I'm based in Toronto. So the team itself is responsible for ESG research, engagement voting, ESG standard setting, policy work, ESG integration. And the way that we've structured human rights and what's important. So I think when responsible investment started at our firm, especially on the European side, which used to be FNC Asset Management. They started the first ethical fund in the 1980s. So we have a very long history of addressing responsible investment issues, including human rights. We've really structured our responsibility, our own responsibility to respect human rights, as well as our expectations from companies as guided by international standards, most of which Anita already mentioned in her presentation, but most notably the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. And now, of course, as well, we are guided by the SFDR in Europe, which requires us to do due diligence on human rights, as they've identified that it can actually impact value as a sustainability risk. So we have a social practices expectation statement, which basically it sets out our expectations of companies on all issues. That includes human rights and refers back to those frameworks that we expect them to adhere to. So that is kind of in the slide that you saw with how investors can respect human rights, that is our sort of upfront communication to let companies know what our expectations are. Then we have, basically that covers our global investment process. Then we have our responsible investment funds that are branded sustainability funds, where we have more stringent requirements around human rights. It's really focused on avoiding the worst performing companies and then investing only once companies meet stringent screening criteria, including on human rights. And I can talk about that more a little bit later. But basically, those funds, our holdings, as well as our criteria, are overseen by our Responsible Investment Advisory Council. This is a third-party council made up of external experts who meet twice a year to discuss the holdings in our funds and our criteria and ESG trends. And that council includes a human rights specialist, Rosie Hurst, who also makes sure that we keep current on all the human rights issues and provides, expert input into our screening strategies. And then, of course, it's really fully embedded into our engagement priority setting, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Rosa. John.
Great, thanks, Anita. So glad to be here today. So I'm John Wilson again. I am Director of Corporate Engagement for Calvary Research and Management. I will update your introduction of me just in one way, which is we are actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Morgan Stanley as of this March. We were acquired late last year, and so that's a new experience for us. But Calvert is, obviously we are a company that has been, had a mission of integrating environment, social, and governance into the investment process since the 1980s. So human rights have been central to our investment approach for a very long time. We've got a long history, both of investing according to human rights principles as well as engagement. And so that's really a very important part. I would say that our approach to integration of human rights into the investment process is really driven by a materiality standard, meaning that we are looking to determine which issues are most important for corporate performance. And I think, as you said earlier, Anita, there are no human rights issues that are not also relevant for corporate performance. But what we try to do is incorporate human rights into the process in a way that makes sense for each individual industry and each individual company. And so that is the approach that we generally take. So the human rights standards are very much embedded into our process, but explicitly we talk about the materiality of each of these issues for our investment results over the long term. So the way that the Calvert is structured essentially is, again, we are a wholly owned subsidiary of Morgan Stanley, but we operate as an independent entity within the larger organization. We have essentially several different functions within Calvert. We have a research team whose job it is to develop our assessments of each companies that ultimately feed into the investment process. We have an engagement team, which I lead, that is responsible for talking to the companies and trying to improve on human rights performance as well as other ESG issues. And then we have a product team that really develops indices that reflect the best research that we have on human rights and other issues. Particularly, we just launched a diversity index where we have found that companies that outperform in measures of diversity also outperform when it comes to financial performance over the long term. So essentially, that's the way our company is structured. We also have from the legacy Eaton Vance, most of our portfolio managers, the people who actually invest the money, are located in Boston. We're in DC. Calvert is in DC. So Calvert itself is very much focused on ESG issues, and we work in partnership with our analysts and portfolio managers, most of whom are located in Boston, to actually create the products that we offer to our clients, most of which are in the form of mutual funds or other commingled strategies.
Right. No, thanks for that, John. And in that context, when we were talking about sort of the human rights risks, so you talked about, where really there is a convergence between human rights risks and business risks as well. So can you share with us what are some of the human rights risks and considerations that you take into account in your investment process? I think you mentioned diversity is one of them.
Sure.
Could you maybe speak to some of the others? And Rosa, please jump in to add your perspective from BMO GAM as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be delighted to. And quite frankly, the concept of human rights is very broad. And so we don't want to limit it to some of the categories that we traditionally associate with quote unquote human rights. So diversity certainly is, the freedom from discrimination is a human right. But there are many others as well. So let's talk about labor standards, right? So many companies, we have concerns about the way that they treat labor, particularly in these times of COVID. I think has illuminated how important it is for companies to address the concerns that their laborers have, and how important that is actually for the functioning of business. So labor standards is one. But if we go also to kind of individual industries, access to healthcare is a human right. And so we look at pharmaceutical companies and how well they provide access both in developed markets and in emerging markets. In finance, we look at questions of access to finance. On the negative side, we think about predatory lending and wanting to avoid those kinds of practices that have been so devastating to so many communities. And then on the positive side, finding access to finance for communities that have traditionally lacked access to finance. We find that both of those issues are quite material for investment performance. Predatory lending, if we think about the roots of the financial crisis of 10 years ago, predatory lending was right in the center of that. Obviously, today, access to finance really provides an opportunity for companies to expand their markets and find new customers. And so many of the conversations that we're having with banks are about how are you doing that? How are you providing additional access to finance, which is really the next step in how companies are growing. So that's a couple of examples that I can provide.
That's great to hear, John. Yes, I mean, we're really looking to, like you said, increase sort of the economic and social performance and inequalities, and so access to finance to marginalized communities and communities who often have not had that access to is a key piece. So it's really good to hear about that. And Rosa?
Yeah, we take a similar broad approach, really looking at all the human rights as set out under the Universal Declaration. So a lot of them were already mentioned by John. I would add we've had substantive work on human rights in supply chains as well. So anything from forced to child labor to worker standards. And then more recently, in the last few years, we've been focusing on human rights related to the technology sector, anything from data privacy to AI and discrimination and surveillance, etc. And that's, alongside the maybe more traditional human rights topics like companies operating in conflict zones, land rights, indigenous rights, etc. And I would say we take both a material lens to this as well as a saliency lens, especially under the European SFDR requirements. We are required to as well prioritize risks that are salient, so really create the most severe impacts to people, even if they haven't materialized yet as material risks to business.
That's right. I mean, really it is about in this context, and particularly relating to, as you mentioned, the sustainable financing disclosure reporting that's required in the EU at the moment. Really, the focus is on risk to people, looking at that, like you mentioned, the severity of it, and that needs to be looked at. As you said, regardless of the materiality issue impacting to business. So as you said, it's kind of an evolutionary process. We're all at different stages of it. And in Europe, I guess they've pushed further on this. And, I think what we're seeing here in capital markets in the United States is that our investors are pushing for it now. That's where investors want to put their funds. So with that, can you tell us maybe a little bit more, Rosa, about how you engage with companies, in terms of, once you're invested in them, how do you really translate your clients' needs, your BMO's sort of positions in your engagement strategies to address human rights harms? And I know, John, that you're, very actively engaged in this area. So please as well share with us any sort of case studies that might really be able to, illustrate this situation. So, Rosa.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe I failed to mention this at the start of the session, but for clarification, we both, our engagement strategy is also a service that we provide for asset owners. So we have about 36 clients, pension funds, foundations, university funds, etc. And we vote and engage on their behalf. So our engagement strategy covers both our own funds as well as the holdings of our clients. And the way it's structured is that we both have proactive engagement as well as reactive engagement. So I'll start with the reactive piece because it's maybe a little bit easier to explain. But basically, we have quarterly flags related to breaches of the UNGC, so the UN Global Compact, and that includes human rights risks. And those are it's more of a breach of international guidelines rather than looking specifically at impact to people. But we are currently building out that sort of data set to make sure we accurately capture the severity of impact to people. So that's a flag that we get every quarter based on both our own holdings as well as our clients' holdings, and then we prioritize engagements accordingly with companies, and that's cross-sectoral. Doesn't matter how small or large the holding is. And then we have our sort of proactive engagements that are based on emerging and current ESG themes. So, for example, currently, we are embarking on a 2-year engagement project, really focusing on human rights and indigenous rights in the mining, oil and gas, and renewable sectors. We're also working closely with the Investor Alliance to address issues of human rights in the technology sector. And then we use the various benchmarks that Anita also mentioned to focus in more on sector-related human rights risks and where we see laggard companies, prioritize those for engagements. And I would say that despite the differences in human rights risks per sector, our approach is really that we ask the same thing of all companies, which is report and act according to the UNG. Sorry, I will say the full name because it's so often I say the abbreviation, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights Pillars, as Anita walked us through. So that's really, we want to see a commitment at the top level and oversight. We want to see companies implementing actual human rights due diligence. We want them to report on this process and their findings, and we want them to remediate any harms that they have caused. And then I would say, lastly, we work with clients quite closely. So we have especially clients who are based out of Europe, who might have, as asset owners, sort of expectations put on them of the OECD guidelines that they really have to report out on, the holdings in their portfolios and what severe impacts they are addressing. So, we're working with those clients to ensure that they can use our engagement information, right, to cover that off. And we also regularly meet with our clients to discuss, names that might be controversial for them or difficult for them, and fill them in on, what our engagement has taught us, etc.
Right, John. I mean, it would be great to give an example of engagement case study, because really translating that is what's going to be really useful. So thanks.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I'll give 3 examples of different kinds of engagements that we do. I'll try to be brief in doing so, but I want to give a feel for the different ways that we might approach engagements on human rights issues. So the first will be kind of a broad and shallow engagement. The second will be a narrow and deep engagement that we call structured engagement. And then the third will be how we sometimes incorporate human rights into engagements on other topics. So let's start with the broad engagement. So we actually we've been engaging on diversity issues, which again, very much a human rights issue, for 30 years. And when all of the conversations around the country happened in the wake of the George Floyd murder, we believe that there was an opportunity to address some of these companies that had made great statements around support for the Black community, to make sure that their operations and their strategies were consistent with what they were saying in public. And so we launched an initiative with the top 100 companies in our portfolios to ask them to disclose their EEO-1 reports. And so for those who are not familiar, the Equal Employment Opportunity Report is kind of a document that is supplied to the federal government every year that details the demographics of the workforce by race, gender, and then job category. And so there's about 140 data points that gives you a sense of the diversity of the company. The problem is that those reports are not disclosed to the public. They're only available to the government. And so we don't have access to that kind of information. So even as the companies were explaining their, kind of their commitment to diversity, there was no way for us as a shareholder to know whether those commitments actually mattered in terms of who was getting hired and who was getting promoted. And so this campaign that we launched, and we did this with a number of other investors as well, so it wasn't just us, asked the companies to make these reports available to the public. And many of them really didn't want to do that, right? Because for various reasons, which we could discuss. But given the times and given the changing expectations of investors, we actually had a lot of success. So at the beginning of our campaign, only 18 out of the top 100 companies were providing these reports. And now today, 58 out of the 100 have agreed to provide those reports. So that's a substantial increase. And we're hoping that over the next year, many of the remaining companies will also decide that times have changed and it's time to actually provide this level of transparency. So that's one. Second is the sort of deeper engagement. So one of the things that we try to do is look at company strategy and understand how the company's approach to human rights may be helping or hindering their strategy as a company, right? And we want to see human rights embedded not just as a separate program or as a compliance function, but really part of the governance and the operations of the company. So one of the things that we're doing is we're working with Harvard University that is actually creating a new way of measuring product impact. So these are called impact weighted accounts, and they try to measure in dollar terms what the impact of products are on society, the environment, and human rights, generally speaking. And so this is a great tool for us to try to start to talk to companies about their product strategy. And do those products actually enhance human rights, or do they contribute to the worsening of situations around the world? And so what we're doing is we're starting to work with different companies, looking specifically at their product strategies, measuring them according to this standard, and then having a conversation with the companies about, are you well positioned for the long term in which human rights are becoming more and more important, right? Are you actually taking on risks that you may not be aware of because your products are having these impacts and you don't know it? So that's an example of kind of a deeper structured engagement. Lastly, and just very quickly, we are also embedding human rights into our discussions around climate change. So climate change is clearly a human rights issue, not usually treated that way, but it is. And one aspect of climate change that is very relevant for human rights is the concept of just transition. And so we're talking about what is the impact on communities as our energy systems change, right? Think about how many people in the United States make their living from fossil fuels, right? We're not talking rich people, right? You know, oil barons. We're talking about ordinary men and women who derive, their income from coal mining, or from, fracking, or whatever it may be. Those people matter. And so we want to know, as companies, for example, utility companies, who've been working with utility companies on energy transition, part of it is, what are you going to do with those workers who are sidelined because what they were working on is no longer the fuel source that you use? So that's an important discussion that has to be part of the climate change conversation. It doesn't negate the importance of dealing with climate change, but it has to be part of the conversation around how the company strategically moves towards a renewable future. So those are my examples.
No, very great examples, and thank you to both of you for sharing them. Rosa?
Yeah, I was just wondering if I could add to that, because I think it's a really great point. I think, on the other hand, if we look at the renewable energy that we will be needing in the future, that will also have impact on local communities. Also, if we think of battery innovation and such, like the mining industry will remain completely important in that. And so, what will be the impact on land rights and Indigenous rights from that perspective? So I think there's both, on the companies that we want to transition towards the low carbon economy, as well as companies that might be providing, solutions to this challenge. There's human rights impact and implications everywhere.
No, exactly. And I was actually going to pick up on that point as well, because this just transition is really a key point. There is a report that I was reading, which is looking at renewable energy companies' human rights performance, and that really goes to the core of just transition. And they were looking at the human rights performance of the top renewable energy companies. So companies that are putting up wind farms, etc., and what they have been doing in terms of clearing the land for these wind farms is exactly what fossil fuel companies had been doing years ago in terms of disregarding the rights of communities. And excuse me. Thank you. And workers as well that are involved in both. We get this view that renewable companies are treating their workers better. They're really not. They're continuing the practices that we seem to put with extractive industries, even in these new green stuff. So really a key piece of information. So I really like that point. And John also mentioned that he was working with Harvard Business School or Harvard University, and one of the participants asked for us to share that information on that report, if that's available. So let's do that. But in that context as well, we were talking about engagement with stakeholders and experts to better understand human rights. And so that's one way you're working with academics and civil society organizations. And I'm wondering whether you can give some examples of where you've worked with similar to that or different to that, really, human rights organizations or communities directly in trying to understand better, and that has actually resulted in a better approach to the whole sort of human rights issues. Either of you, please feel free to jump in.
For me, 3 examples spring to mind. So one of them would be our work on forced labor in supply chains. So we've partnered for some of the companies that didn't quite make the cut into our responsible investment funds because we had some concerns about practices within their factories. We have partnered them with an NGO that really looks at how to enhance local factory level situations for workers. And basically under that agreement, you know, if a company progresses their relationship with this NGO and enhances their standards within their factories, you know, we will continue to be investing in them. So that is one example where this NGO has been incredibly, you know, useful to us also because they can tell us what it actually looks like on the ground. Secondly, I think the Investor Alliance itself is a really a great place for us to, as investors, connect with civil society. We have regular updates from civil society groups on human rights related issues through the Investor Alliance meetings. And where we have, you know, a big engagement with particular companies. We might also connect, for example, with workers at those companies who've raised issues publicly related to the same topic. And then lastly, I'm thinking of the global tailings safety standard that it was recently released, which is really a multi-stakeholder effort to, after the Brumadinho dam collapse, basically where a lot of people died, investors as well as other stakeholders realized there need to be better safety standards in order to protect people. And so, you know, we helped formulate the standards that is now in place, which, you know, provided also was built with input from affected people and civil society.
John, or yeah.
Yeah, I think so I would also actually raise another ICCR group called the Investor Opioid and Pharmaceutical Accountability Group, which is a group that Calvary has been working with for a long time on obviously this issue of opioids, which again, another human rights issue, access to healthcare, but also against predatory practices of companies. And that is a group that we have had a lot of success with, working directly with companies with other investors. And then we've had the opportunity through ICCR to have the experience of many groups, many NGO groups on this issue as well. So that's one example. Another is, and I'm blanking on the name, and I apologize for that. I will try to find it out and make sure we hear about it. There are new groups now developing standards for companies on issues of data privacy and cybersecurity. And this is the challenge for us as investors. It's such a new issue and such evolving so quickly that how do we know what standards to hold companies to? And I think we rely upon sort of people who are really expert in these areas to help us think through those issues. And you know, that's another kind of an example. And I apologize. I will try to find that name and make sure that we raise it before the end of this. And then I would actually mention a third, because this is something that I think may be obvious, but not, you know, maybe not traditionally what we think of, but the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is a group of, again, it's a multi-stakeholder coalition. It's investors, it's companies, and it's also other kinds of stakeholders coming together to determine what are the reporting standards that companies should employ in sort of explaining their human rights risk. And that's a very important function as well, because again, we can spend a lot of time arguing about what companies should be saying, but if we can come together and agree on a standard, then we can get beyond that into some of the more substantive conversations around improving performance.
And I think that kind of brings me to kind of the next question that I had, which was really data, right? I mean, that's what really investors need: the information, the data to assess their human rights performance as it relates to to their investments and their investment activities. And so I know that today a lot of us look at the ESG reports and rankings that come out from great companies like Sustainalytics and MSCI. But I do know as well that a lot of the data relating to the S in particular is not as robust as we would like it to have. And if we do have as investors that responsibility to respect human rights, we need that data. So in addition to investors as a whole sort of pushing ESG data providers to get that information, who will then push on companies to get that information. I mean, I think that's one action that investors need to do, is to ask for that information. I wanted to ask you what challenges have you faced in obtaining credible and robust data, and how have you sort of tried to address that gap in the interim? Rosa.
Yeah, I can start. I think, yeah, we all agree that the social aspect of ESG data is it is not as firm as we would like it to be. There are a couple ways that we've tried to mitigate that. I mean, we do use several of the major ESG and data service providers. I mean, I mentioned as well that we use the more specialized benchmarks that are out there that are that go a little bit more deeply onto looking at human rights issues for particular sectors. So, the Responsible Mining Foundation benchmark, Corporate Human Rights benchmark, Ranking Digital Rights, Know the Chain, etc. But then, I lost my train of thought. There was, of course, something very important that I wanted to say.
As difficult as it's to get data, we're trying to pull it from so many different places.
Yeah, I remember now. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us is, now that we're also using that saliency lens, so not looking at just risks to business, but risk to people, is how to assess severity of impact to people. Is it how many people have died or have been injured, or how many people have been negatively affected? And it also doesn't feel very fair to quantify that type of harm. So that's been a challenge. We do use Rep Risk as a service that doesn't just look at company disclosure itself, but looks at sources also, including NGO reporting in various different languages, so that we can also see what human rights defenders are saying about particular company, which has helped us tremendously, because that data isn't always captured by the traditional data provider.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's really important to go beyond the company reporting, because typically company reporting on human rights has been more about process than about performance. And so it's fine to have those processes in place, but you don't know how effective they are. And so I think Rep Risk is one example of a data source that can be helpful with that. True Value Labs is another one. One that we find very interesting is called SigWatch, which is they actually monitor NGO activity and look at whether companies are being praised or criticized, and then that helps them, so those kinds of things are there. And I think the fact that we have much better tools around AI, so particularly machine learning and natural language processing, has made it much easier to kind of aggregate this kind of data in a way that is meaningful to investors, because you're just not going to get company reports on human rights like emissions data, for example, right? It's got to be something different. One of the biggest challenges, though, that we find in the data is the inconsistency. So if you're looking at different kinds of vendors, very often they're coming to different conclusions about the companies themselves. And so one of the things that we at Calvary have done, we've invested quite a bit in data science, in trying to kind of pull apart the scores that we're getting from the various vendors and trying to reconcile some of the issues that are coming out and figuring out which measures are the most effective for our purposes. And so, that's been traditionally been a big problem in ESG data, is just the inconsistency among different providers. But even so, I think that the modern tools of data science allow us to overcome that to some extent. So it's a process.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to move to some of the questions. I've kind of hit some of the questions in from the audience in some of the questions I've asked you, but I'm going to pose some of the questions that have come in for both John and Rosa. How does your ESG group interface internally with the portfolio managers? Do you have to sell them on these ideas to buy in, or are they required to follow your recommendations, re-owning companies or engaging companies, or even in divesting for companies?
I can start.
Sure,
go ahead,
yeah.
Rosa.
No, go ahead, John.
Okay, so that's a good question. So it depends is the answer. So with regard to engagement, so the engagement team is responsible for proxy voting. So we have our proxy voting guidelines. We vote our proxies, and that we are responsible for that at the end of the day. With regard to engagement, we do not need to, actually get permission from the portfolio managers, but very often they are an important input for us. And so on particularly some of our most important kind of deeper engagements, we may actually partner with the portfolio manager to get the benefit of their, of their expertise. We certainly partner with our ESG analysts. So I mentioned that the engagement team and the research team are separate. We definitely partner with the research team to get the benefit of their expertise on different kinds of engagement. So we, and the engagement team, we sort of decide what to engage with, but we rely upon them as resources. In terms of the investment process, so traditionally at Calvert, the research process yields an eligible or ineligible decision. So companies are eligible to be held in Calvert portfolios or not. And so portfolio managers are required to avoid holding companies that are ineligible, obviously. More and more, however, many of the managers are starting to incorporate the research that we're doing into their investment decisions. So the research is actually much more robust than simply a binary decision. There's actually a lot of really good information there, and that they are actually starting to think about the ESG implications in making investment decisions. So that is, I think, in the world of investing in evolving process, I think we're getting much better at it. So that's our process.
John.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. If you're going to take on that one.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I think obviously engagement with the portfolio managers is a really important element of good ESG integration. With us, it's structured quite similar as to what John was mentioning. But I would say for our responsible investment branded funds, we kind of retain the decision whether or not, and this is with really close collaboration with the PMs, whether or not they can invest in certain companies or should divest. So our input there is quite important. Then on the non-branded responsible investment funds, I would say we provide monthly data to all of our PMs with our own assessment of ESG risks across all companies. So that's using both third-party data as well as, we created our own tilts within that data to reflect more what we think is important. And then lastly, we're also responsible for educational sessions for portfolio managers. So we do monthly sessions on various ESG topics, including human rights related topics, and then provide things like, what data points should you look at, et cetera, to make sure that our PMs are educated on ESG.
So, John, you had mentioned, I want to attack to the question on SASB, which came from one of the audiences, to the extent that you use it and how you use it. And Rosa, obviously, you're welcome to jump in as well, because that's something our audience recognizes and wants to understand a little bit better how to use it.
Yeah. So I think in terms of engagement, one of the ways is just as a standard that we can give to companies that is an accepted standard for reporting. And so as companies start to wrestle with the question of how should we be reporting on these issues, SASB is a very credible standard for that. I think also SASB data works its way into our research process, though I would say somewhat indirectly. So because we rely upon the data vendors, but the data vendors themselves are using this information, and when it is much more standardized, then it's much more useful for the data vendor to be able to issue some sort of a comparative analysis of the company. So I would say both from the research and the engagement standpoint, the SASB data and increasing standardization of ESG information is quite helpful. I would say a third is one of the things that we're thinking about now, and this is actually particularly true in the EEO1, but also for SASB, is that looking to create common assessments of companies across industries and so forth. Having that standardized data is really important, right? Just as a research tool, because the better we can do that, the better we can assess the materiality of some of the issues that the companies are dealing with.
I'm gonna, oh, go ahead, Rosa, did you have?
Just one more thing to add there. I think when we do policy engagement, so say engagement with governments or standard setters, we've been engaging our local security commission here, for example, to push for sort of mandated ESG disclosure according to SASB standards. So it's of course, we are also engaging our companies to use SASB as a framework, but if it can be mandated either by when companies list, that obviously would solve a lot of our problems. So that's been an engagement that we've been doing in various countries in the world.
Michael, before you jump in, can I just say one more quick thing on SASB? So, SASB is, a standard like, that is being used more and more often. And SASB does look at materiality, which is really looking at it from a business risk perspective. So the Investor Alliance, together with other civil society organizations like Rights Collab, have actually started engaging with SASB directly to talk more broadly about the fact that when we look at material risk, we can't just look at material risk to business, but we need to look at obviously material risk or salient risk to people. So this is an ongoing dialogue because it is we talk about the fact this is an evolutionary process, right? So it's never fixed. And so as we change with what's required by the marketplace or by regulations, we need to continually inform ourselves. And in fact, while we use the term salient risk versus material risk to give sort of two aspects to it, in the EU regulations, they just talk about double materiality, which is looking at material risk from two different angles, which is the angle from the business and angle from people, put risk to people. And so we really are trying to bring a lot of that into our discussions with SASB. And so, just wanted to share that as well, sort of a viewpoint.
Actually, it's perfect because before I got to the last question, which opens up a new topic, I wanted to talk about the salience question. And, for a lot of folks listening, it's materiality, understand SASB. Salience seems much fuzzier. And I'd love to, for both of you and Anita, to share what you think, how has salience been valuable? Or is it something that how are you dealing with it? I know there's some topics or examples that you can give, because I think, Rosa, you mentioned that, well, salience is stuff that is not yet material, but could be. So I'm curious, some examples of issues that you've seen and perhaps how you think that may help folks to think about the salience part.
Where to start? It's a really great question. Yes, I think so. Perhaps to go back a little bit under OECD guidelines, as well as the SFDR requirements, looking at salient risk to people really means you have to prioritize where the most severe risks to people occur. So an example where salient risk might not have yet become material for a company is, for example, when it's actually one of the examples that Anita mentioned in her presentation. For example, a company produces a part that then is used for surveillance, and that surveillance technology in itself might not be, directly sold to a repressive regime, but it becomes clearer and clearer that it is used by that repressive regime. This means that the company, is linked in some way to a potential human rights abuses, and that we can see that if this is used for example, genocide, obviously that is an incredible salient risk because it has such severe impacts to people. However, the business that is creating the surveillance technology, it might just be a very small part of their revenue. It might be a part of their business that is like Amazon. Amazon is huge. They might say this is not material to us because it represents less than 1%, of our income.
Yeah, I would say if we're thinking about the long term, right, and if we're investing for the long term, so our investors will be with us for decades. And so the question of materiality and salience becomes much fuzzier the longer term you think. And so what I think the distinction would be, because I don't want to make it seem like we're in the business of ignoring human rights risks that do not pose an immediate challenge to the company's valuation. I don't think that's the point here. Materiality for us may mean different things in different parts of our business. So for example, it may or may not be important for an asset manager to trade today on a salient issue that isn't necessarily material yet. It certainly, and it may or may not play out as a top tier issue in a research model, but certainly from a governance standpoint, we would want to know that the companies are well positioned in understanding these emerging risks that they face. And if they're not, right, if they're saying, well, it's a small part of our revenue, so we'll just keep doing it, that raises some larger questions about the governance of the company. And so, right, whether or not this is a company that recognizes that a small risk today can blow up into a big risk tomorrow, we care about that, right? We care about the governance of the company. So if we're thinking holistically, and if we're thinking long term, I don't think we want to let salience go if it's not immediately material, but it may affect how that issue works its way into our process. So let me give you, I think, the example that comes up for me all the time: human trafficking. Right, human trafficking is obviously an issue that is incredibly salient and something that should be intolerable in a civilized world, right? And yet it happens, and it happens in supply chains, often very deep into the supply chains of the companies, and therefore may or may not be directly material to the financial performance of the company. That does not mean that companies should not be taking this seriously, partly for ethical reasons, and because you have employees who do not want to work for a company that is facilitating human trafficking, and because because it may raise some concerns about how well you're managing your supply chain. So other kinds of human rights and other supply chain issues may arise in an environment where human trafficking can flourish. So I think that we have to recognize it isn't so much that there's a distinction between these two issues, but rather that we have to understand how the interplay exists between them and what that means for us as investors. Again, as investors, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients. Our clients, there are about 300,000 of them. They are ordinary people saving for retirement or for other reasons. We have a responsibility to maximize their returns. And I think, so we have to focus always on materiality, but we cannot ignore salience, because salience will ultimately become material for performance in the lifetime of that investment. So, just some thoughts there.
Well, I think with that, actually, on that note, we've had a great discussion. We've managed to get to most of the questions. I'm sorry we might not have gotten to all of them, but I really would like to thank my panelists, for this great discussion, and really hand it back to Michael.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Rosa, John, and Anita. It really, it really has been terrific. You mentioned we couldn't quite get to everything. One question was about water and water rights. One of the things we encourage audience members to feedback to us too, because we would like to build on what we did today, and there are other topics that come right out of this. So we'd love to hear from you of topics you'd like us to dig into with perhaps a more focused session as we go forward. I think it's been an incredible experience. I think we've provided some resources, and we will certainly, if there are questions, you can get back to us directly. We'll be happy to share those. This recording will be available. We're actually going to take several sessions that we're going to do over the next month or two and put them together. But we hope you, and if you have a chance, you can take a look again if there are questions you have, but encourage others to look at it. I hope this has provided the kind of a framing and really opened up some interesting questions for you and helped you think about S issues and human rights issues, because it is a challenging topic. We're going to be spending a lot more time on it, and it can be easy to get lost. And John and Rosa and Anita, I think you've really helped people put some signposts and some guideposts into this today. So on behalf of CFA Society Boston, our Sustainable Investing Initiative, thank you so much. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in some other venue soon.
Yeah, thank you for organizing this webinar. So thanks to everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.